Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be comparing the noise levels from the A7 IV starting from ISO 100 to 25,600 when compared to the A7R IV and the A7R III. Stay tuned. Some of you might be asking why I would bother doing this. It's obvious to many people that the more densely packed the pixels are, as in the A7R IV with its 61 megapixels, the more noise you're going to have in the image. While this is true when you blow up the image up to 100%, it's actually not true when it comes to resizing the image or printing the image to the same size as another camera that has a lower pixel density. I'm going to show you what this looks like when you take images from all three of these cameras, the A7 IV being 33 megapixels, the A7R IV being 61 megapixels, and the A7R III being 42 megapixels. And see what happens when you resize them to the same size. Let's have a look right now. So this is the award-winning photo that I'll be using as my comparison. It comes complete with a few dog toys, a nice bright orange and blue ball at the bottom. But what I'm really going to concentrate on for this comparison is just 100% crop of this image spanning both the A7 IV, the A7R IV, and the A7R III. Here's the same view from the A7R IV, and also the same view with the A7R III. Now let's look at that 100% crop. The first image here is 100% crop using the A7 IV on the left and the A7R IV on the right. So from now on, the A7 IV will always be on the left and the A7R IV or R3 will be on the right. At 100 ISO, this is really just as a base image. There's very little difference in the characteristics of the images. There's probably a slightly different look to the images, but not anything that's significant to me. The A7R IV images can look a little softer, or like they look like they have maybe a little bit more depth of field, but that has nothing to do with the camera or the lens, since it's really based on how I focused on that armrest of the chair. But I also should mention that this is using the Sony 20mm f1.8 at f1.8. So let's keep moving forward. This is the A7R III on the right, and the same goes for it. Very little to notice. Now, the first image where things change, we move from 100 ISO to ISO 320. For my eyes, if I look as close as possible, I can just barely see a slight grain at 100%. It's definitely not something you would notice at full screen size or in a print for that matter. So we can move on from this one because the noise characteristics are surprisingly similar between the A7 IV and the A7R IV. Now here's the R3 on the right. And same thing goes for this one. There's very little difference. Now for me, when we move to 640 ISO, this is the first time we actually start to see some noise. Now I really have to get right up to my screen to notice any difference here, but there is a tiny bit of noise, and you really only notice it on the flat gray of this image, which is the whole point for me to have this flat gray part in there. You won't notice this noise anywhere else in the image, but where there's a flat color like this, then you can actually see that there is some noise. Fully acceptable. Looks very similar between the two cameras. And then we move to the A7R III on the right. Again, they're very similar. Now let's move to 1000 ISO. Now I can see that there's some image noise, and it looks pretty similar to me on both images here. Probably a slight bit of extra noise on the A7 IV, but nothing that bothers me. I notice the color stays pretty consistent. Now comparing the A7 IV and the A7R III, again, they're very similar. These are ISOs that I don't really care about, since the only time I really want to see the difference between any of these is at 1600 ISO and up. So now let's look at 1600 ISO. There we can definitely see some noise at 100%, but it's still fully acceptable for me, both on the A7 IV and the A7R IV on the right, and they're quite similar. If I had to look at any of these images individually, I would have no idea which camera is which. And then same goes for when we switch to the A7R III on the right. The characteristics are very similar. So 1600 ISO is fine. Now I've moved up to 3200 ISO, which is typically close to the highest that I like going. I will go a little higher if I'm pushed really hard, but only in an event type situation. I won't do this for portraiture or anything like that. But while shooting events, 3200 ISO is perfectly fine, and it cleans up quite nice with a little bit of noise reduction. Now, if you look at both images and you go back and forth between the two, you'll see some noise, and it's surprisingly similar between the two images. I can't see much difference. I do notice the gray, though, on the A7 IV looks a little better in terms of just the color. It's not blotchy, and it's also staying gray, where it's maybe a slightly reddish tinge with the A7R IV. And then adding in now the A7R III on the right, I do see some more blotchiness. I can even see a little bit of a green tinge that has been introduced, but the grain level is still very much the same. Now let's jump up to 6400 ISO, which is not my favorite ISO to be going to while I'm shooting, but it's quite obvious that there's a good amount of grain, very similar on both sides here. And again, the color stays a lot more solid, I find, on the A7 IV. I can now compare the A7R III. Very similar if I go back and forth, although the color cast is getting worse, I find, on the A7R III. Now we've moved up to 12,800 ISO, which is something I would only use in an absolute emergency when I'm photographing. It's not something I want to use, although now that I look at the A7 IV, the grain is there for sure, and I don't hate it, mainly because it looks more natural. The color stays pretty consistent. The details on the armrest are not falling apart, although when I look at the A7R IV on the right and I look at the details of the armrest, I do find the details have gotten a little softer just because of the grain, where they are nice and consistent on the A7 IV. Let's throw in the A7R III, and I would say quite the same, although it doesn't look that bad. Again, the color cast, though, I can see a lot of green in there. Now, one last look at 25,600 ISO. This is definitely an ISO that I probably will never use, but let's have a look. For some reason, the A7 IV just holds on to that color. I can see a tiny bit of green blotching coming into that image, although on the right, looking at the A7R IV, there's all kinds of magenta and green blotches moving all through that gray. It's not something I would probably notice at screen size, but it's certainly noticeable at 100%. And the A7R III actually doesn't look quite as noisy as the A7R IV, and I don't hate it, but same characteristics as the other high ISO shots. Now, this image I only put in here as an example to make sure that there was no question about how much detail you're getting out of the A7 IV. If you look at the spiral of the armrest near the bottom, on the left we have the A7 IV, on the right we have the A7R IV. And when you look at the detail amount, and I very carefully focused with this image and I put it at f5.6, there is no loss or lack of detail on the A7 IV compared to the A7R IV. This is something I wanted to really check because I've heard a lot of reports about people saying how much detail there is when you look at the A7R IV. Finally, I just want to say one last thing about image noise in general. If you look at this first image, it's the Sony A7IV at f1.8, 100 ISO. Everything looks great. It's just a snapshot really, but overall the colors look good. There's no grain, it just looks good. And then if you switch over to 6400 ISO, it still looks fine. It's not exactly the same, doesn't matter. You can always process it to make it look exactly the same. But when it comes right down to it, there isn't a huge amount of difference. And even more so when you look at the same image, 6400 ISO with noise reduction, the amount that it looks different from the one that's 100 ISO when viewed in a normal way, like on a print or at just even screen size, but not 100%, the differences aren't that big. Especially when you're printing or putting something into an album, that kind of grain sometimes adds character, and it's actually not nearly as bad as we like to make it out to be, mainly because we have this bad habit of looking at everything at 100% on our computer screens. The good news is that these amounts of noise are completely usable and completely tolerable and can be minimized in post-production. So what do you think? What did you think about the differences between all of the images? It's obvious to me that the A7 IV images are more true to life with the colors as you get into higher ISOs, and they also seem to preserve the detail a little bit better. Looking at the 61 megapixel image of the A7R IV, it seems to me that the image starts to fall apart when you get into the higher ISOs. But in reality, none of this really matters to me, since when you're printing an image and you're printing it anywhere above 6400 ISO, you really don't see a lot of noise, for one, but also you're never looking at it at 100%, meaning you're not zooming into the full pixel size of any image. So I think it's time that we put this debate to rest, although I'd really like to hear your opinions on everything. I'd also like to apologize for the chewing noises that you may hear in the background, because I have a dog that's chewing a bone about 5 feet away from me right now. Anyways, thanks very much for watching. Please feel free to subscribe and give me a like if you enjoyed or found this video interesting in any way, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again, we'll see you soon.